Blackwells Quiet Heart. Paris, 1919. Elizabeth Garrison had kept a framed photo of Major Nathaniel Blackwood since the day he left for war. But tonight, something was wrong. His pose had shifted. His gaze, once directed at the camera, was now looking at her. Chapter 1. The photograph that changed overnight. The scent of rain-soaked cobblestones and distant wood smoke drifted through the open window of Elizabeth Garrison's small Parisian apartment. It was a scent that, even a year after the armistice, still carried the phantom echoes of gunfire and the metallic tang of blood. She'd grown accustomed to it, woven it into the fabric of her new, strangely quiet life. But tonight, the familiar smells offered no comfort. Tonight, everything felt off. Elizabeth traced the ornate, silver frame of the photograph on her bedside table. Major Nathaniel Blackwood. The name, even whispered in the silence of her room, sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of longing, fear, and a growing, inexplicable dread. He was the reason she was here, in Paris, clinging to the edges of a life that had once seemed so vibrant, so full of promise. The photograph had been her constant companion since the day he'd left for the front, 4 years ago. A handsome man, Nathaniel, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and a jawline that could cut glass. In the picture, he was in his uniform, the brass buttons gleaming, his posture ramrod straight, his gaze fixed firmly on the camera lens, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. A soldier's smile, brave, confident, hiding a universe of unspoken anxieties. But tonight, something was profoundly wrong. Elizabeth leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. The gaslight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the room, across the image of the man she loved, the man she had promised to wait for. His pose had shifted. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. He was no longer looking at the camera. His head was tilted, ever so slightly, and his eyes were looking directly at her. A chill, colder than the November night air, snaked its way through her. She'd looked at this photograph 1,000 times, memorized every detail. The way a stray lock of dark hair always escaped his cap, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a childhood tumble. She knew this photograph. And this wasn't it. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. The silver was cold against her skin. The back was sealed, the brown paper brittle with age. She'd never taken it apart, never dared to disturb the fragile image within. It felt like a betrayal, somehow, to even consider it. "It's just the light," she whispered, her voice a shaky breath in the stillness. "Just the shadows playing tricks." But the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. She ran a finger over the glass, over Nathaniel's face. His eyes, those intense, gray eyes, seemed to follow her movement. A prickle of unease, sharp and insistent, bloomed in her chest. Elizabeth had arrived in Paris in 1917, a volunteer nurse, driven by a desperate need to be closer to Nathaniel, to contribute to the war effort, to do something other than wait and worry. She'd seen the horrors of war firsthand, the mangled bodies, the shattered minds, the endless stream of young men sacrificed to the insatiable hunger of the trenches. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to build walls around her heart, to focus on the task at hand, saving lives, easing suffering, offering a fleeting moment of comfort in a world consumed by chaos. But Nathaniel had always been the chink in her armor, the one vulnerability she couldn't quite conquer. Their love had blossomed in the brief, golden summer before the war, a whirlwind of stolen kisses, whispered promises, and the intoxicating belief that their future was limitless. He'd been a young lieutenant then, full of idealism and a burning sense of duty. She'd been a headstrong, independent woman, determined to make her own way in the world, even if it meant defying the expectations of her family. Their love had been a secret, a precious flame hidden from the prying eyes of a society that wouldn't have approved of their mismatched backgrounds. He was the son of a wealthy industrialist, destined for a life of privilege and power. She was the daughter of a struggling artist, more comfortable in a bohemian garret than a grand ballroom. The war had changed everything. It had thrown their carefully constructed worlds into disarray, stripping away the pretense, leaving only the raw, essential core of their feelings for each other. Their letters, exchanged across the vast, dangerous expanse of the battlefield, had been their lifeline, a testament to a love that refused to be extinguished by distance or despair. Elizabeth set the photograph back on the table, the silver frame clinking softly against the wood. She walked to the window, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. The city below was a tapestry of shadows and flickering lights, the Eiffel Tower a skeletal silhouette against the inky sky. The sounds of Paris, the rumble of a distant tram, the mournful wail of a saxophone from a nearby cafe, the hushed voices of late-night revelers drifted up to her, a constant reminder of life continuing, even in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. She'd stayed in Paris after the armistice, unable to face the thought of returning to England, to the empty spaces where Nathaniel should have been. She'd found work as a translator, using her fluency in French to help with the ongoing peace negotiations, clinging to the hope that somehow, some way, he would find his way back to her. But the letters had stopped. 6 months ago. The last one had been brief, almost cryptic, hinting at a dangerous mission, a secret assignment. And then silence. The War Office had been no help. They'd offered polite condolences, vague assurances, the standard bureaucratic responses that did little to ease the gnawing emptiness in her heart. She'd considered him lost, another casualty of a war that had claimed so many. She'd mourned him, grieved for the future they'd lost, the life they'd never have. But now this photograph. This impossible, inexplicable change. A sudden, sharp rap at the door startled her. She jumped, her heart pounding against her ribs. Who could be calling at this hour? She wasn't expecting anyone. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Fear, cold and clammy, tightened its grip on her. The city, for all its beauty, was still a dangerous place, especially for a woman alone. Another rap, more insistent this time. And then a voice, low and muffled, but undeniably familiar. Elizabeth? It's me. Let me in. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't be. Slowly, her hand shaking, she turned the knob and opened the door. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, his face obscured by the shadows, was a man in a worn, travel-stained coat. He stepped into the light, and Elizabeth gasped. It was Nathaniel. But not the Nathaniel in the photograph. This Nathaniel was older, harder, his face etched with lines of pain and weariness she hadn't seen before. The stormy gray eyes, however, were the same, burning with an intensity that made her knees weak. But there was something else in his eyes, something she couldn't quite decipher, a flicker of fear, perhaps? Or was it warning? He reached for her, his hand closing around hers, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. Elizabeth, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Thank God you're here. We haven't much time. He glanced back down the hallway, his body tense, his senses on high alert. And in that instant, Elizabeth knew. This wasn't a reunion. It was something else entirely. Something dangerous. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Parisian Twilight. Time for what? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper, her mind struggling to reconcile the man standing before her with the ghost she'd been mourning for months. The warmth of his hand, surprisingly strong despite his gaunt appearance, was the only thing anchoring her to reality. The apartment, the city, the very air around them seemed to shimmer with unreality. Nathaniel pulled her inside, shutting the door quickly and quietly behind him. He leaned against it, his chest heaving slightly, as if he'd run a great distance. His eyes, still holding that unsettling mixture of relief and apprehension, scanned the room, taking in every detail. We can't stay here, he said, his voice low and urgent. It's not safe. Not safe? Elizabeth echoed, her confusion growing. Nathaniel, what's going on? Where have you been? Your letters, they stopped. The questions tumbled out, a torrent of unspoken anxieties finally unleashed. He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the delicate curve of her cheekbones. The touch was both familiar and foreign, a reminder of the man she'd loved and a glimpse of the stranger he'd become. "I know," he said, his voice thick with regret.
"I'm sorry.
"I couldn't write. I couldn't risk it." He glanced at the photograph on the bedside table, his expression unreadable. "That how long has it been like that?" Elizabeth followed his gaze, the unsettling image of the altered photograph sending another shiver down her spine.
"Since tonight," she said.
"I don't understand it. It's impossible." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He turned away from the photograph, his gaze sweeping the room again, lingering on the windows overlooking the street. "It's a warning," he said, his voice barely audible. "They know I'm here. They know I'm looking for you." "Who?" Elizabeth asked, her heart pounding. "Who knows? And why is the photograph?" He cut her off with a shake of his head. "There's no time to explain. We need to leave.
Now."
He took her hand again, his grip firm and insistent. "Trust me, Elizabeth. Please. Just for a little while longer. I promise I'll explain everything, but we need to get to safety first." The urgency in his voice, the fear in his eyes, were undeniable. Elizabeth had seen that look before, in the faces of the wounded soldiers she'd tended to in the field hospitals. It was the look of a man facing imminent danger, a man who knew that his life, and perhaps the lives of others, hung in the balance. She hesitated for only a moment, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Her instincts, honed by years of navigating the treacherous currents of wartime Paris, screamed at her to be cautious, to question everything. But the look in Nathaniel's eyes, the desperate plea in his voice, overrode her doubts. She trusted him with her heart once before, in a world that had seemed much simpler, much safer. She'd trusted him with her life across the miles, across the battlefields, across the silence that had separated them for so long. Could she trust him now, in this strange, unsettling new reality? "All right," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll come with you, but you have to tell me what's going on. I deserve to know." Nathaniel nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "I will," he promised. "But not here.
Not now."
He led her to a small, dusty trunk in the corner of the room. "Take only what you need," he said. "We have to travelite." Elizabeth quickly packed a few essentials, a change of clothes, her worn medical kit, a small, leather-bound journal, and the last, precious letter she'd received from Nathaniel, the one that had hinted at his dangerous mission. She hesitated over the photograph, her fingers lingering on the silver frame. The altered image still disturbed her, but she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. It was a link to the past, a reminder of the love they'd shared, and perhaps a clue to the mystery that was unfolding around them. She tucked it carefully into her bag. Nathaniel watched her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to understand her reluctance to leave the photograph, her need to hold onto something tangible in a world that was rapidly shifting beneath her feet. "Ready?" he asked, his voice soft. Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She took one last look around the small apartment, the place that had been her refuge, her sanctuary, for the past year. It felt like a lifetime ago. Nathaniel opened the door a crack, peering out into the hallway. He listened intently for a moment, his body tense, his senses on high alert. Then he nodded, satisfied that the coast was clear. "Stay close to me," he whispered, his hand brushing against hers. "And don't say a word." He led her out of the apartment and into the dimly lit hallway. The building was quiet, the only sounds the creaking of the old floorboards and the distant murmur of the city outside. They moved quickly and silently, like shadows in the twilight. As they reached the ground floor, Nathaniel stopped abruptly, his body stiffening. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling Elizabeth to be silent. He listened intently, his head cocked to one side. Elizabeth strained her ears, trying to hear what he heard. At first, she heard nothing but the usual night sounds of Paris. But then, she caught a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere outside. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the building. Nathaniel's eyes met hers, his expression grim. He mouthed a single word, go. He pushed her towards the back entrance of the building, a narrow, dark alleyway that led to a maze of interconnected courtyards and back streets. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, the sounds of the approaching footsteps echoing in her ears. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to escape. She had to trust Nathaniel, even if it meant running blindly into the unknown. The Parisian twilight, once a comforting cloak, now felt like a suffocating shroud, full of hidden dangers and whispered threats. Chapter 3. A shadow across the Seine. The alleyway was a labyrinth of shadows and refuse, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Elizabeth stumbled over loose cobblestones, her breath catching in ragged gasps. She could hear Nathaniel behind her, his footsteps lighter, quicker, but still close enough to offer a fragile sense of security. He was her shield, her protector, even as she questioned the very reality of his return. They emerged from the alleyway onto a narrow, deserted street that ran parallel to the Seine. The river, a dark, shimmering ribbon under the pale moonlight, reflected the flickering gaslights along the quay, creating an eerie, almost ethereal glow. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of the water and a hint of the sea beyond. Elizabeth paused, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She leaned against a cold, stone wall, trying to catch her breath. Nathaniel stopped beside her, his eyes scanning the street, his body still tense, alert. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight was beginning to fade, leaving her feeling weak and vulnerable. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He continued to scan the street, his gaze lingering on the shadows that danced along the buildings. He seemed to be listening for something, his senses straining to detect any sign of pursuit. "Somewhere safe," he said finally, his voice low and guarded. "Somewhere they won't find us." "Who are they?" Elizabeth pressed, her frustration growing. "Nathaniel, you have to tell me what's going on. I can't keep running blindly." He turned to her, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight. The lines of weariness and worry were etched even deeper now, making him look older than his years. But his eyes, those intense, gray eyes, still held a spark of determination, a flicker of the man she remembered. "It's complicated," he said, his voice hesitant. "It involves things I can't speak of freely." "Not yet." "Things you were doing on your dangerous mission?" Elizabeth asked, her voice laced with a hint of bitterness. The silence, the unanswered letters, the months of agonizing uncertainty, it all came flooding back, a wave of resentment washing over her. Nathaniel flinched, as if her words had struck a physical blow. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the dark, flowing waters of the Seine. "Yes," he said quietly. "That mission. It had changed everything." He paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "I uncovered something that put me in danger. Something that could have serious consequences, not just for me, but for others as well." "What kind of consequences?" Elizabeth asked, her fear returning, colder and sharper than before. He hesitated again, his eyes searching hers. "I can't tell you everything," he said. "Not yet. But I can tell you this. I was betrayed. By someone I trusted. Someone close to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Betrayal. It was a word that resonated deeply in the aftermath of the war, a word that had shattered countless lives, destroyed countless hopes. "Who?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who betrayed you?" Nathaniel shook his head.
"I don't know for sure," he said.
"But I have my suspicions, and I need to find proof. That's why I came back. To find the truth, and to make things right." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I need your help, Elizabeth," he said. "I can't do this alone." Elizabeth's heart ached at the raw honesty in his voice. Despite her fear, despite her doubts, despite the unanswered questions that swirled around them, she knew she couldn't refuse him. She'd loved him once, with all her heart. And even now, after everything that had happened, a part of her still clung to that love, to the hope that it could somehow be salvaged from the wreckage of the war. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steadier now, her resolve hardening. Nathaniel smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
"Just stay with me," he said.
"Stay close.
"And trust me."
That's all I ask." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. The touch was warm and reassuring, a lifeline in the darkness. "We need to get across the river," he said, his gaze turning towards the Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in Paris, its stone arches silhouetted against the night sky. "There's a safe house on the left bank. We can rest there, and I can explain more." They started walking, their footsteps echoing softly on the deserted street. The Seine flowed beside them, a dark, silent witness to their clandestine journey. The shadows seemed to deepen, to lengthen, as they approached the bridge, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. As they reached the middle of the bridge, Elizabeth paused, her gaze drawn to the dark waters below. She thought of the countless lives that had been lost in the war, the countless secrets that were buried beneath the surface of the city. She thought of the altered photograph, the warning it represented, the danger that seemed to be lurking around every corner. A sudden movement in the shadows caught her eye. A figure, dark and indistinct, emerged from beneath the arches of the bridge, moving towards them with a slow, deliberate gait. Elizabeth's heart leaped into her throat. She squeezed Nathaniel's hand, her fingers digging into his. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone's there." Nathaniel followed her gaze, his body tensing. He recognized the figure instantly, his face hardening with a mixture of anger and recognition. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He released her hand, his own hand moving towards the inside of his coat, where Elizabeth knew he kept a small, but deadly, pistol. The figure continued to approach, the moonlight glinting off something metallic in his hand. It was a knife, and as the figure drew closer, Elizabeth saw his face. It was a face she recognized, a face she'd seen in the photograph, a face that had haunted her dreams. But it wasn't Nathaniel's. It was the face of the man who had betrayed him, and he was smiling. Chapter 4. The Unsent Letter. The man's smile was a cruel, predatory slash across his face, devoid of any warmth or humanity. He stopped a few feet away, the knife held loosely in his hand, its blade catching the moonlight like a sliver of ice. Elizabeth recognized him now, with a sickening jolt of realization. It was Major Alistair Finch, Nathaniel's second-in-command, a man she'd met only once, briefly, during a hurried visit to headquarters in Amiens. She remembered him as charming, affable, a man who seemed utterly devoted to Nathaniel. The memory felt like a cruel mockery now. Well, Finch said, his voice a smooth, silky purr that sent shivers down Elizabeth's spine. "Look what we have here. The prodigal son returns."
And with his little nurse in tow.
Nathaniel stood his ground, his body shielding Elizabeth, his hand still concealed inside his coat. "Finch," he said, his voice cold and hard, devoid of any emotion. "I should have known it was you." Finch chuckled, a low, throaty sound that echoed across the deserted bridge. "Oh, come now, Nathaniel.
Don't tell me you're surprised."
You always were a bit naive, weren't you? Too trusting. Too eager to believe the best in people. "What do you want, Finch?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Finch shrugged, his eyes flicking towards Elizabeth. "What do I want? Why, I want what's rightfully mine, of course. The recognition, the reward, the spoils of war. Things you were too foolish to take for yourself." "You betrayed your country," Nathaniel said, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "You betrayed your men. You betrayed me." Finch laughed again, a harsh, mocking sound. "Betrayal is such a strong word, Nathaniel. Let's just say I realigned my priorities. I saw an opportunity and I took it."
Simple as that.
You sold information to the enemy, Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous. You sent men to their deaths. You're a traitor, Finch. And you'll pay for what you've done. Finch's smile widened. Oh, I don't think so, Nathaniel. You see, I have friends in high places. Friends who are willing to overlook my little indiscretions. Friends who are very interested in keeping certain secrets buried. He took a step closer, the knife glinting menacingly in his hand. And you, my dear Nathaniel, are a very big secret. A loose end that needs to be tied up. Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She could feel the tension radiating from Nathaniel's body, the coiled energy of a man preparing to strike. Don't do this, Finch, Nathaniel said, his voice warning. It doesn't have to end this way. Finch ignored him. He lunged forward, the knife flashing towards Nathaniel's chest. But Nathaniel was faster. He drew his pistol, the movement swift and practiced. The shot rang out, deafening in the stillness of the night. Finch staggered backward, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. He clutched at his chest, a crimson stain blossoming on his uniform. He stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him. He collapsed onto the cold, stone pavement of the bridge, the knife clattering beside him. Elizabeth stared in horror, her body frozen, her mind reeling. She'd seen death before, countless times, in the field hospitals. But this was different. This was cold-blooded, calculated, a deliberate act of violence. Nathaniel stood over Finch's body, his pistol still smoking, his face a mask of grim determination. He looked at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and relief. He gave me no choice, he said, his voice hoarse. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak. She understood. She'd seen the look in Finch's eyes, the cold, calculating gleam of a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Nathaniel knelt beside Finch's body, his hand searching for a pulse. He found none. He closed Finch's eyes, a gesture of respect, even in death. We need to go, he said, his voice urgent. Someone must have heard the shot. We can't stay here. He helped Elizabeth to her feet, his hand supporting her, guiding her. They hurried away from the bridge, leaving Finch's body lying alone in the moonlight, a stark reminder of the betrayal and violence that had shattered their lives. They found refuge in a small, nondescript cafe, tucked away in a quiet side street near the Sorbonne. The cafe was nearly empty, only a few late-night patrons huddled in the corners, nursing their drinks and their secrets. Nathaniel chose a table in the back, far from the windows, where they could be hidden in the shadows. He ordered 2 strong coffees, his hand trembling slightly as he placed the order. Elizabeth watched him, her heart aching for the burden he carried, the weight of the secrets he'd been forced to keep. When the coffee arrived, Nathaniel took a long, slow sip, his eyes closed, as if savoring the warmth, the momentary respite from the chaos that surrounded them. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said finally, his voice low and apologetic. Elizabeth shook her head. It's all right, she said. I understand. You did what you had to do. She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was cold, despite the warmth of the coffee. Tell me everything, she said, her voice firm. I need to know. I need to understand what's going on. Nathaniel nodded. He took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength. He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant, slowly unraveling the tangled web of deception and betrayal that had led them to this moment. He told her about the secret mission, the coded messages, the double agents, the dangerous game of espionage he'd been playing. He told her about Finch, his trusted second-in-command, the man who had betrayed him, the man who had sold secrets to the enemy for personal gain. He told her about the unsent letter, a letter he'd written to her, explaining everything, a letter he'd never dared to send, fearing it would fall into the wrong hands. A letter he now pulled from his coat pocket, its paper worn and creased, its ink faded, but its words still carrying the weight of his unspoken love and his desperate plea for forgiveness. He handed it to her, and as she began to read, the final piece of the puzzle clicked in. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Somme. The letter was dated 6 months prior, written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl that reflected Nathaniel's state of mind at the time. Elizabeth unfolded the delicate paper carefully, her fingers trembling as she traced the familiar handwriting. My dearest Elizabeth, if you are reading this, it means I have failed. It means I have not been able to return to you as I promised. It means the mission has gone terribly wrong. I cannot tell you the details, not in writing. It is too dangerous. But I can tell you this. I have uncovered a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of command. A conspiracy that involves the deliberate sabotage of our war effort, the sale of vital information to the enemy, and the sacrifice of countless lives for personal gain. I believe Major Finch is involved. I have no proof yet, but my instincts scream at me to be wary of him. He is too eager to please, too quick to offer his assistance. He is a snake in the grass, Elizabeth, and I fear he is poised to strike. I am surrounded by enemies, my love. I trust no one. I am walking a tightrope, and one wrong step could send me plummeting into the abyss. I know this is not what you wanted to hear. You wanted me to come home, to leave the war behind us, to build a life together. I wanted that too, Elizabeth, more than anything. But I cannot abandon my duty. I cannot stand by and watch as innocent men are sent to their deaths because of the greed and corruption of a few. I am sending this letter with a trusted courier, a man I believe I can rely on. He will deliver it to you only if something happens to me. If you receive it, please know that I loved you, Elizabeth, with all my heart. You were the light in my darkness, the hope that kept me going through the horrors of this war. Forgive me, my love. Forgive me for not being the man you deserved. Forgive me for breaking my promise. Forgive me for leaving you alone. Yours eternally, Nathaniel. Elizabeth finished reading the letter, her eyes filled with tears. The words were a testament to Nathaniel's courage, his integrity, his unwavering love for her. They were also a confirmation of her worst fears, a chilling glimpse into the dangerous world he'd inhabited, the risks he'd taken, the sacrifices he'd made. She looked up at Nathaniel, her heart aching for the burden he'd carried, the pain he'd endured.
Why didn't you tell me?
She asked, her voice choked with emotion. Why didn't you trust me? Nathaniel reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers gently wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. I wanted to protect you, he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't want to drag you into this mess. I thought if I kept you in the dark, you would be safe. Safe? Elizabeth echoed, a hint of bitterness in her voice. I haven't been safe since the day you left for the war. I've lived in fear, Nathaniel, fear of losing you, fear of the unknown. Silence was not protection, it was torture. Nathaniel flinched, as if her words had struck a physical blow. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from his coffee cup. I know, he said quietly. I was wrong. I should have trusted you. I should have told you everything. He paused, his eyes searching hers.
But it's not too late, he said.
We can still fix this. We can still expose the truth and bring the guilty to justice.
How?
Elizabeth asked, her voice filled with doubt.
Finch is dead.
He was your only lead, wasn't he? Nathaniel shook his head. He wasn't my only lead, he said. He was just the most obvious. There are others involved, others higher up the chain of command. I have some names, some suspicions. But I need proof. Concrete evidence that will stand up in a court of inquiry. He leaned closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. There's a coded message, he said. Hidden somewhere in Finch's belongings. A message that contains the names of his co-conspirators, the details of their plot. If we can find that message, we can expose them all. Where is it? Elizabeth asked, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. I don't know, Nathaniel admitted. But I have a hunch. Finch had a flat near the Place de la Concorde. He used it for discreet meetings. I think the message might be hidden there. We need to go there, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. We need to find that message. Nathaniel nodded. But we need to be careful, he said. Finch's friends will be looking for us. They'll be watching his flat, waiting for us to show up. They finished their coffee in silence, their minds racing, formulating a plan. The cafe, which had seemed like a refuge only moments before, now felt like a trap, a place where they could be easily cornered. As they stepped back out into the night, the air was thick with the echoes of the Somme, the distant rumble of artillery fire, the screams of the wounded, the metallic tang of blood. It was a reminder of the war that had brought them together, the war that had torn them apart, the war that still haunted their every waking moment. But amidst the echoes of the past, there was a new sound, a faint, flickering spark of hope. The hope of finding the truth, of exposing the betrayal, of finally putting the ghosts of the war to rest. And as they walked towards Finch's flat, their hands clasped tightly together, Elizabeth knew that they were not alone. They had each other, and that, perhaps, was all they needed to face the dangers that lay ahead. The echoes of the Somme were fading, replaced by the quiet determination of two hearts beating as one. Chapter 6. The Rendezvous at Notre Dame. The streets leading to the Place de la Concorde were largely deserted, the late hour and the chill November air keeping most Parisians indoors. The grand, sweeping boulevards, designed to impress and intimidate, felt eerily empty, their usual vibrancy muted by the darkness. The obelisk at the center of the place, a towering monument to ancient Egypt, stood like a silent sentinel, casting a long, dark shadow across the square. Nathaniel led Elizabeth through a maze of side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares, his senses on high alert. He knew they were being watched, hunted. Finch's death would have alerted his co-conspirators, and they would be desperate to silence anyone who could expose their treachery. Finch's flat was located in a discreet, unassuming building on a quiet street just off the Rue de Rivoli. The building was typical of Parisian architecture, with tall windows, ornate balconies, and a heavy, wooden door that led to a dimly lit courtyard. "Stay close to me," Nathaniel whispered, his hand resting on the pistol concealed inside his coat. "And be ready for anything." They slipped into the courtyard, their footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones. The air was still and heavy, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of traffic and the faint sound of music drifting from a nearby cafe. Nathaniel approached the door to Finch's flat, his hand reaching for the doorknob. He paused, his senses straining to detect any sign of danger. He listened intently, his ear pressed against the door. He heard nothing. He turned the knob slowly, cautiously. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, silent interior. He stepped inside, his pistol drawn, Elizabeth close behind him. The flat was surprisingly luxurious, furnished with expensive antiques, plush carpets, and ornate artwork. It was a stark contrast to the Spartan conditions of the trenches, a testament to Finch's ill-gotten gains. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and perfume, a lingering reminder of Finch's decadent lifestyle. "Search the place," Nathaniel said, his voice low and urgent. "Look for anything that seems out of place. Any hidden compartments, any coded messages, any documents that might be relevant." They began their search, moving quickly and systematically through the rooms. Elizabeth searched the bedroom, carefully examining the drawers, the wardrobe, the bed itself. Nathaniel focused on the study, a room filled with bookshelves, a large desk, and a locked safe. The silence was broken only by the rustling of papers, the creaking of floorboards, and the occasional muffled curse as they encountered obstacles. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Elizabeth found nothing of significance in the bedroom. The drawers contained only clothes, neatly folded and arranged. The wardrobe held a collection of expensive suits and uniforms. The bed was made, the sheets smooth and unruffled. She moved on to the living room, her eyes scanning the walls, the furniture, the ornate decorations. She noticed a small, antique writing desk tucked away in a corner. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The desk was locked. She tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. She searched for a key, but found none. She called out to Nathaniel, her voice low and urgent. "Nathaniel, I need your help. I've found a locked desk." Nathaniel came rushing into the room, his pistol still in his hand. He examined the desk, his eyes narrowing. "Stand back," he said. He aimed his pistol at the lock and fired. The shot echoed through the flat, the sound deafening in the confined space. The lock shattered, the drawer springing open. Inside the drawer, Elizabeth saw a small, leather-bound book. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. She opened the book, her eyes scanning the pages. The book was filled with coded messages, written in a complex cipher that Elizabeth couldn't decipher. But interspersed among the coded messages were names, dates, and locations. Names she recognized, names of high-ranking officers, politicians, and industrialists. Dates that corresponded to major battles, major losses, major setbacks for the Allied forces. Locations that hinted at secret meetings, clandestine rendezvous, and covert operations. It was the proof they'd been looking for. The evidence that would expose Finch's co-conspirators, the evidence that would bring them to justice. A sudden noise from the hallway startled them. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching the flat. Nathaniel grabbed the book from Elizabeth's hand.
Go,
he whispered. Get out of here. I'll hold them off. Elizabeth hesitated, her eyes filled with fear and concern. But Nathaniel, go. He repeated, his voice firm. I'll meet you at Notre Dame. At midnight. Don't be late. He pushed her towards the window, which overlooked a small, enclosed garden. Climb down the fire escape, he said. It's our only chance. Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She climbed out the window, her legs shaking, her hands gripping the cold metal of the fire escape. She descended quickly, silently, her eyes fixed on the ground below. She reached the garden, her feet landing softly on the damp earth. She looked back up at the window, her heart aching for Nathaniel, her fear for his safety overwhelming. She saw him silhouetted in the window, his pistol raised, his body tense, ready to face whatever came through the door. He gave her a final, fleeting nod, a silent farewell. Then, she turned and ran, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth, her heart heavy with the weight of their uncertain future. She ran towards Notre Dame, towards the rendezvous, towards the hope that they would somehow, some way, survive this night. The image of Nathaniel, standing defiant at the window, was seared into her heart. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past. The streets were a blur of shadows and flickering lights as Elizabeth raced towards Notre Dame. The cathedral, a majestic Gothic masterpiece, loomed large in the distance, its twin towers piercing the night sky like ancient guardians watching over the city. The sound of her own ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart were the only companions on her desperate flight. She reached the Parvis de Notre Dame, the large open square in front of the cathedral, her lungs burning, her legs aching. The square was deserted, the usual crowds of tourists and worshippers absent at this late hour. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the Seine against the nearby quays and the distant tolling of a church bell. Elizabeth scanned the square, her eyes searching for any sign of Nathaniel. He wasn't there. She checked her small, travel-worn watch. It was almost midnight. She leaned against one of the massive stone buttresses of the cathedral, trying to catch her breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The cold stones seeped through her thin coat, chilling her to the bone. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the gnawing fear that consumed her. What if Nathaniel hadn't made it? What if Finch's co-conspirators had caught him? What if she was alone again, left to face the dangers of this treacherous world without him? She closed her eyes, her mind conjuring images of Nathaniel, his face, his smile, his voice. She remembered the brief, golden summer before the war, the stolen moments of joy and laughter, the whispered promises of a future that had seemed so bright, so full of possibility. She remembered the horrors of the field hospitals, the endless stream of wounded soldiers, the stench of blood and antiseptic, the constant presence of death. She remembered the letters, exchanged across the battlefields, their lifeline, their connection, their testament to a love that refused to be extinguished. She remembered the photograph, the altered image, the warning it represented, the mystery that had brought them to this moment. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the massive, ornate doors of the cathedral. They were closed, locked, seemingly impenetrable. But Elizabeth knew that beyond those doors lay a sanctuary, a place of peace and refuge, a place where she could perhaps find the strength to face whatever the future held. A sudden movement in the shadows caught her eye. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving towards her with a slow, deliberate gait. It was Nathaniel. He was limping slightly, his coat torn, his face bruised and bloodied. But he was alive. Elizabeth rushed towards him, her arms wrapping around him, holding him tight. He held her close, his body trembling, his breath ragged. I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm here," he said, his voice hoarse. "I made it." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Did you find it?" he asked, his voice urgent. "The message?" Elizabeth nodded, her hand reaching into her bag, pulling out the small, leather-bound book.
"It's here," she said.
"It's all here." Nathaniel took the book, his fingers tracing the worn leather, his eyes scanning the pages. He smiled, a faint, weary smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
"We did it," he said.
"We found the proof." He leaned against the cathedral wall, his body slumping with exhaustion. He looked at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this mess. I'm sorry for putting you in danger." Elizabeth shook her head.
"Don't be," she said.
"I chose to be here. I chose to help you." She reached out and gently touched his bruised face, her fingers tracing the lines of pain and weariness. "You're hurt," she said, her voice filled with concern. "We need to get you somewhere safe, somewhere you can rest." Nathaniel nodded.
"There's a small apartment," he said.
"Near the Jardin du Luxembourg. It's a safe house, used by some of my contacts. We can stay there for the night." They started walking, their pace slow and uneven, Nathaniel's limp slowing them down. They moved through the deserted streets, the silence broken only by their footsteps and the occasional distant siren. As they walked, Elizabeth noticed a small, almost imperceptible scar on Nathaniel's hand, a scar she hadn't seen before. It was a thin, white line shaped like a crescent moon. "What's that?" she asked, her voice curious. Nathaniel glanced at his hand, his expression unreadable. "It's an old wound," he said, his voice evasive. "From the war?" Elizabeth pressed. Nathaniel hesitated. "Yes," he said finally. "From the Somme." He didn't elaborate, and Elizabeth didn't press him further. She knew that the Somme had been a horrific battle, a place of unimaginable suffering and loss. She knew that Nathaniel had seen things there, experienced things that had left deep scars, both visible and invisible. Scars he clearly wasn't ready to share. They reached the apartment, a small, nondescript flat on the top floor of an old building overlooking the Jardin du Luxembourg. The apartment was sparsely furnished, but clean and comfortable. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could finally rest, finally let down their guard. Nathaniel collapsed onto the small sofa, his body exhausted, his mind racing. Elizabeth tended to his wounds, cleaning and bandaging his bruises, her touch gentle and caring. As she worked, she couldn't help but think about the scars of the past, the wounds that both she and Nathaniel carried, the wounds that had shaped them, defined them, bound them together. The scars of war, both physical and emotional, were a constant reminder of the horrors they'd endured, the sacrifices they'd made, the love they'd shared. And as she looked at Nathaniel, sleeping soundly on the sofa, she knew that those scars, however painful, were also a testament to their resilience, their strength, their unwavering commitment to each other. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together, scarred but not broken. Chapter 8. A Dance of Deception. The morning light, filtering through the dusty curtains of the safe house, painted the room in a pale, ethereal glow. Elizabeth woke to the sound of Nathaniel moving around the small apartment, the quiet clinking of cups and the murmur of his voice as he spoke on a borrowed telephone. She stretched, her body stiff and sore from the previous night's ordeal, but her mind surprisingly clear. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a quiet determination. Nathaniel hung up the phone and turned to her, a faint smile on his lips.
I've made arrangements, he said.
We need to move quickly. We're meeting someone who can help us decipher the code and get the information to the right people. Who? Elizabeth asked, sitting up and pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders. The apartment was chilly, despite the weak morning sun. His name is Dubois, Nathaniel said. He's a former cryptographer for the French army. He's retired now, but he still dabbles. He owes me a favor. Can we trust him? Elizabeth asked, a flicker of apprehension in her voice. Trust was a precious commodity in this world of spies and double agents. Nathaniel nodded. I believe so, he said. He's a man of honor, or at least he used to be. The war changed everyone, Elizabeth. But I have to trust someone. And Dubois is our best hope. They dressed quickly, their movements efficient and practiced. They were like two dancers, moving in perfect synchronicity, their steps guided by an unspoken understanding. They had been through so much together, faced so many dangers, that they had developed a rhythm, a silent communication that transcended words. They left the apartment, leaving no trace of their presence. They moved through the streets of Paris, their senses on high alert, their eyes scanning the crowds, searching for any sign of surveillance. They were like actors on a stage, playing their roles, pretending to be ordinary citizens, while their hearts pounded with fear and anticipation. They met Dubois in a small, unassuming café near the Canal Saint-Martin. The café was bustling with activity, filled with the chatter of voices, the clatter of dishes, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was a perfect place for a clandestine meeting, a place where they could blend into the crowd, disappear into the anonymity of the city. Dubois was an older man, with a wizened face, a sharp mind, and a cynical air. He greeted Nathaniel with a curt nod, his eyes flicking towards Elizabeth with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. This is Elizabeth, Nathaniel said. She's with me. Dubois nodded again, his gaze lingering on Elizabeth for a moment longer. He seemed to be assessing her, weighing her up, deciding whether she could be trusted. The code, Dubois said, his voice raspy. Show me. Nathaniel handed him the leather-bound book. Dubois opened it, his fingers tracing the coded messages, his eyes narrowing in concentration. He worked quickly, efficiently, his mind a well-oiled machine, deciphering the complex cipher with ease. As he worked, he muttered to himself, his voice a low, guttural rumble. Elizabeth watched him, her heart pounding with anticipation. The fate of so many people, the future of their own lives, hinged on this moment, on this man's ability to unlock the secrets hidden within the coded messages. After what seemed like an eternity, Dubois looked up, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and grim satisfaction. I've cracked it, he said, his voice hoarse. It's a list of names, dates, and locations. A detailed account of a conspiracy to undermine the Allied war effort. A network of high-ranking officials, industrialists, and spies, working together to prolong the war for their own personal gain. He handed the book back to Nathaniel. The names they are shocking, Nathaniel. People you would never suspect. People in positions of power, people you trusted. Nathaniel took the book, his hand trembling slightly. He scanned the list of names, his face paling with each name he recognized. It's worse than I thought, he said, his voice low and anguished. Much worse. What do we do now? Elizabeth asked, her voice urgent. We need to get this information to someone who can act on it. Nathaniel nodded. There's only one person I can trust, he said. General Armand Dubois. He clarified, seeing the look of confusion on her face, no relation to our cryptographer. General Dubois is head of military intelligence. A true patriot. I will go to him. I'm coming with you, Elizabeth declared. He put up a hand. No. I need to ensure the general will listen. He won't, if he thinks this a lover's quarrel or a way to frame an enemy. It's too dangerous. I can protect myself, and I am useful, Elizabeth asserted, meeting his intense gaze. I know, he said softly, but I can't risk it. Please, wait here. I will call for you once the information is safe. It's a dance of deception, my love, one I must perform alone for now. He leaned in and kissed her, a brief, desperate kiss that spoke volumes of his love and his fear. He left, disappearing into the bustling crowd, leaving Elizabeth alone with Du Bois, the cryptographer, and the weight of the secrets they had uncovered. The dance of deception had begun, and she could only wait and pray that Nathaniel would survive the performance. Her heart ached with a feeling that this dance held a darker, more sinister choreography than she could possibly imagine. Chapter 9. The Spy Among Us. Waiting was a torment. Elizabeth paced the small, back room of the cafe, Du Bois watching her with a mixture of amusement and pity. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against her nerves. She tried to distract herself, focusing on the mundane details of the cafe, the chipped mugs, the worn tablecloths, the faded posters on the walls, but her mind kept returning to Nathaniel, to the dangers he faced, to the uncertain outcome of his mission. Du Bois, sensing her anxiety, offered her a small glass of brandy. "Drink this," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "It will calm your nerves." Elizabeth accepted the drink gratefully, the fiery liquid burning a path down her throat, momentarily easing the knot of tension in her stomach. "He's a brave man, your Nathaniel," Du Bois said, his eyes fixed on the swirling liquid in his own glass. "A good man. Too good for this dirty business." "He believes in justice," Elizabeth said, her voice defensive. "He believes in doing what's right, no matter the cost." Du Bois chuckled, a dry, cynical sound. "Justice," he scoffed. "A rare commodity in this world, my dear. Especially in times of war. The lines blur, the truth becomes distorted, and the innocent often suffer along with the guilty." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and wisdom. "You love him," he said, his voice stating a fact, not asking a question. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "More than anything," she whispered. Du Bois sighed. "Love," he said. "Another rare commodity. A fragile flower that often withers in the harsh climate of war." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, towards the bustling street outside. "I hope, for your sake, that your love is strong enough to survive this," he said. "Because this is just the beginning." His words sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. She knew he was right. The exposure of Finch's conspiracy was just the first step. There were others involved, others who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, their power, their ill-gotten gains. The hours crawled by, agonizingly slow. Elizabeth continued to pace, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She imagined Nathaniel, facing General Du Bois, presenting the evidence, pleading his case. She imagined the general's reaction, his shock, his disbelief, his eventual acceptance of the horrifying truth. She imagined the consequences, the arrests, the trials, the upheaval that would follow. She imagined the enemies they would make, the dangers they would face. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the telephone rang. Elizabeth jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Du Bois answered the phone, his voice curt and businesslike. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. He said a few words, then hung up the phone. He turned to Elizabeth, his face grim. "It's Nathaniel," he said. "He wants you to meet him. At the Gare du Nord. He says it's urgent." Elizabeth's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and foreboding. He was alive. He had succeeded in presenting the evidence. But why the Gare du Nord? Why the urgency? She didn't waste time questioning Du Bois. She grabbed her bag, thanked him for his help, and rushed out of the cafe, her mind racing, her heart filled with a growing sense of unease. The Gare du Nord, one of Paris's largest railway stations, was a chaotic scene of bustling crowds, echoing announcements, and the hissing of steam engines. It was a place of comings and goings, of reunions and farewells, of hopes and dreams. It was also a place where it was easy to get lost, to disappear, to become anonymous. Elizabeth searched the crowded platforms, her eyes scanning the faces, searching for Nathaniel. She found him standing near the departure board for trains to the north, his back to her, his body tense, his shoulders slumped. She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. Nathaniel? She said, her voice trembling slightly. He turned around, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and horror. He looked broken. Elizabeth, he said, his voice hoarse. Thank God you're here. He reached for her, his hands gripping her arms, his fingers digging into her flesh. We need to leave, he said, his voice urgent. We need to get out of Paris.
Now.
What's wrong? Elizabeth asked, her fear returning, colder and sharper than before. What happened? Did you see the general? Nathaniel nodded, his eyes darting around the crowded station, as if searching for someone or something.
I saw him, he said.
I gave him the evidence.
He believed me.
Then what's wrong? Elizabeth pressed, her confusion growing. Why do we need to leave? Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, a deep, soul-crushing despair. He believed me, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. But it doesn't matter. Because he's one of them. He pulled her close. General Dubois. He is the spy, Elizabeth. The head of it all.
He was playing me. He was playing us.
His grip tightened. And he knows we know. The crowded station suddenly felt like the most dangerous place on earth. Chapter 10.
Stolen moments, stolen kisses.
The revelation hit Elizabeth like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending her reeling. General Dubois, the very man Nathaniel had trusted, the man he had believed to be their savior, was the mastermind behind the conspiracy. The world tilted on its axis, the familiar landscape of trust and loyalty dissolving into a treacherous swamp of deception and betrayal. We need to disappear, Nathaniel said, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning the crowded station. He'll have alerted his people. They'll be looking for us. We're not safe anywhere in Paris. He pulled her towards the departure platforms, his hand gripping hers tightly, his pace quick and purposeful. The bustling crowds, the echoing announcements, the hissing of steam engines, it all seemed to fade into a muffled roar, a backdrop to their desperate flight. Where are we going? Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling slightly. She struggled to keep up with his pace, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. I don't know, Nathaniel admitted, his voice hoarse. Somewhere, anywhere. We just need to get away from here. We need to buy some time, to think, to plan. They reached a platform where a train was preparing to depart. The destination board read, Le Havre. It was a port city on the coast of Normandy, a place of ships and sailors, of comings and goings, of anonymity. It was as good a place as any. Nathaniel pulled her onto the train, just as the whistle blew and the doors began to close. They found an empty compartment, collapsing onto the worn seats, their bodies trembling, their breaths ragged. The train lurched forward, slowly gathering speed, pulling away from the station, leaving Paris behind. Elizabeth looked out the window, watching the city recede into the distance, the Eiffel Tower a shrinking silhouette against the gray sky. She turned to Nathaniel, her eyes searching his. He looked exhausted, defeated, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nathaniel shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor of the compartment. I don't know, he admitted. I made a mistake. I trusted the wrong person. I put us both in danger. Elizabeth reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was cold, despite the warmth of the train compartment. It's not your fault, she said, her voice firm. You did what you thought was right. You tried to expose the truth. You tried to do the honorable thing. But it wasn't enough, Nathaniel said, his voice bitter. It was all for nothing. We're back where we started. Worse, even. Now, they know we're onto them. They'll be hunting us. We'll figure something out, Elizabeth said, her voice filled with a determination that surprised even herself. We always do. She leaned closer, her body pressing against his, seeking comfort and warmth. She reached up and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of weariness and worry. We're in this together, she said, her voice soft. We always have been. We always will be. Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke volumes of his feelings for her. It was a kiss of desperation, of fear, of uncertainty. But it was also a kiss of hope, of resilience, of unwavering commitment. The train rattled along the tracks, carrying them further and further away from Paris, further and further into the unknown. The landscape outside the window blurred into a tapestry of fields and forests, of villages and towns, of ordinary lives continuing, oblivious to the drama unfolding within the confines of their train compartment. They stole moments, stolen kisses, stolen glances, clinging to each other, finding solace in their shared love, their shared danger. They were like two fugitives, on the run from an unseen enemy, their future uncertain, their fate unknown. But in those stolen moments, in the warmth of their embrace, in the tenderness of their touch, they found a fleeting sense of peace, a momentary respite from the fear and the uncertainty. They found a reminder of the love that had brought them together, the love that had sustained them through the horrors of war, the love that would, hopefully, see them through this new, treacherous chapter of their lives. As the train sped towards Le Havre, towards the sea, towards an uncertain future, Elizabeth knew that their journey was far from over. The dance of deception had taken a deadly turn, and they were now caught in a web of intrigue and betrayal that threatened to consume them both. But they were not alone. They had each other, and that, perhaps, was all they needed to survive. The stolen moments were all they had, but they were enough.
For now.
Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty. Le Havre was a city shrouded in mist, the salty air thick with the smell of the sea and the cries of gulls. The port, a bustling hub of activity even in the dim light of late afternoon, offered a stark contrast to the quiet desperation of their train journey. Ships from all corners of the world lined the docks, their masts and rigging creating a tangled forest against the gray sky. Nathaniel led Elizabeth through the crowded streets, his hand gripping hers tightly, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. They were like two shadows, flitting through the labyrinthine alleyways and bustling marketplaces, trying to blend in, to disappear, to become invisible. "We need to find a place to stay," Nathaniel said, his voice low and urgent. "Somewhere inconspicuous. Somewhere they won't think to look for us." "And then what?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling slightly. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They were fugitives, hunted by a powerful and ruthless enemy, with no resources, no allies, and no clear plan. Nathaniel shook his head, his gaze fixed on the narrow, winding streets ahead. "I don't know," he admitted. "We need to think. We need to find a way to expose Du Bois, to clear our names, to survive." They found a small, run-down hotel near the docks, a place that catered to sailors and transient workers, a place where no one asked questions and everyone kept their secrets. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a rickety table, and a cracked window that offered a view of the bustling harbor. They collapsed onto the bed, their bodies exhausted, their minds racing. The silence of the room was broken only by the distant cries of gulls and the muffled sounds of the city outside. Nathaniel sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders slumped, his body trembling with exhaustion and despair. Elizabeth sat beside him, her hand resting on his back, offering silent comfort. "I never should have involved you in this," Nathaniel said, his voice muffled. "I should have left you in Paris. You would have been safe there." "Don't say that," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "I made my choice. I chose to be with you. I chose to help you. And I don't regret it." She reached out and gently lifted his chin, forcing him to look at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with tears. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice filled with a conviction she didn't quite feel. "We always do. We're stronger together." Nathaniel managed a weak smile, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. He leaned forward and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke volumes of his love and his gratitude. They spent the rest of the day huddled in their small room, trying to formulate a plan. They reviewed the evidence they had, the coded messages, the list of names, trying to find a way to use it to their advantage. But the more they talked, the more they realized the enormity of the task before them. They were up against a powerful and ruthless enemy, an enemy who controlled the levers of power, an enemy who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As darkness fell, the sounds of the city outside grew louder, more insistent. The cries of gulls, the rumble of trucks, the shouts of sailors, it all seemed to press in on them, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked outside their small sanctuary. A sudden knock at the door startled them. Nathaniel jumped up, his hand reaching for the pistol he had concealed under his pillow. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice tense. A voice, muffled and unfamiliar, answered. "Message for Monsieur Blackwood." Nathaniel hesitated, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's. They exchanged a look of fear and uncertainty. He opened the door cautiously, his pistol held at the ready. A young boy, no older than 10, stood in the hallway, his face dirty, his clothes ragged. He held out a small, crumpled envelope. "This is for you, monsieur," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "A man, he gave me a franc to deliver it." Nathaniel took the envelope, his hand shaking. He dismissed the boy, closing the door and locking it. He tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents. The message was brief and to the point. "Meet me at the abandoned lighthouse on the North Cliffs. Midnight. Come alone, or the woman dies." The message was unsigned, but Nathaniel knew who it was from. It was from Du Bois. He looked at Elizabeth, his face pale, his eyes filled with despair. "He's got us," he said, his voice hoarse. "He knows we're here. He knows everything." Elizabeth stared at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. The price of loyalty had just been revealed, and it was terrifyingly high. She knew what Nathaniel would do. He wouldn't hesitate. Chapter 12. A Night of Revelations. The abandoned lighthouse stood like a skeletal sentinel on the windswept cliffs north of Le Havre. It was a desolate, lonely place, battered by the relentless force of the sea, its once bright beacon extinguished, its stone walls crumbling, a stark reminder of forgotten promises and broken dreams. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping the waves into a frenzy, the salty spray stinging their faces. Nathaniel had insisted on going alone, despite Elizabeth's desperate pleas to accompany him. He had been adamant, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. "It's too dangerous, Elizabeth," he had said. "Du Bois is playing a game, and I don't want you to be a pawn in it. I need to do this alone. I need to protect you." He had left her hidden in a small, abandoned fisherman's shack near the base of the cliffs, promising to return, promising to survive. But Elizabeth knew, deep in her heart, that his chances were slim. He was walking into a trap set by a ruthless and cunning enemy, a trap from which he might not escape. She waited in the darkness, her body shivering from the cold, her heart pounding with fear and anxiety. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of her watch a hammer blow against her nerves. The sound of the wind and the waves, the distant cries of gulls, the creaking of the old shack, it all seemed to magnify her fear, to heighten her sense of isolation and vulnerability. She paced back and forth, her mind racing, imagining the scene unfolding at the lighthouse. She imagined Nathaniel, facing Du Bois, confronting him, demanding answers. She imagined Du Bois, his face a mask of cold calculation, his eyes devoid of any empathy or remorse. She imagined the violence, the struggle, the inevitable outcome. Suddenly, she heard a sound, a faint, muffled sound that cut through the roar of the wind and the waves. It was a gunshot. Elizabeth's heart stopped. She rushed to the door of the shack, her hands trembling, her eyes straining to see through the darkness. She saw nothing, only the black, windswept cliffs, the churning sea, the skeletal silhouette of the abandoned lighthouse. She waited, her breath held captive in her chest, her senses on high alert. She waited for another sound, another sign, another indication of what had happened at the lighthouse. But there was nothing, only the silence, the darkness, the relentless howl of the wind. After what seemed like an eternity, she saw a figure emerge from the darkness, stumbling towards the shack. It was Nathaniel. He was limping badly, his coat torn, his face covered in blood. But he was alive. Elizabeth rushed to meet him, her arms wrapping around him, holding him tight. He collapsed against her, his body trembling, his breath ragged. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel nodded, his head buried in her shoulder. "I'm alive," he said, his voice hoarse. "But Du Bois, he's dead." He pulled back slightly, his eyes meeting hers. His face was a mask of pain and exhaustion, but there was also a flicker of something else, something that looked like relief. "I killed him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I had no choice. He was going to kill me." Elizabeth stared at him, her mind reeling. She had expected violence. She had expected a struggle, but she had not expected this. She had not expected Nathaniel to kill Du Bois. "Tell me," she said, her voice urgent.
Tell me everything.
Nathaniel leaned against the wall of the shack, his body slumping with exhaustion. He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant, slowly unraveling the events that had transpired at the lighthouse. He arrived at the lighthouse to find Du Bois waiting for him, a pistol in his hand, a cruel smile on his face. Du Bois had taunted him, mocked him, revealing the full extent of his treachery, his betrayal, his involvement in the conspiracy. He had confessed to everything, to selling secrets to the enemy, to sabotaging the Allied war effort, to sacrificing countless lives for his own personal gain. He had boasted of his power, his influence, his ability to manipulate events, to control people, to get away with murder. But then, Du Bois had revealed something else, something that had shocked Nathaniel to his core. He had revealed the truth about the photograph, the altered image, the warning it represented. It was a test, Blackwood, Du Bois had sneered. A test to see if you were still susceptible, to see if you still held a flame for your little nurse. The photograph hadn't changed by magic or some supernatural force. It had been altered by Du Bois's agents, a subtle manipulation, a way to monitor Nathaniel, to track his movements, to gauge his reactions. And then, Du Bois had made his final, fatal mistake. He had threatened Elizabeth. "I have people watching her, Blackwood," he had said. "If you don't cooperate, if you don't give me the evidence, she will die. A slow, painful death." That was when Nathaniel had snapped. He had lunged at Du Bois, tackling him to the ground, wrestling for the pistol. The gun had gone off, the shot echoing through the night. Du Bois had fallen, his body lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Nathaniel finished his story, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with tears. He looked at Elizabeth, his gaze pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. "I didn't want to kill him," he said, his voice hoarse. "But he gave me no choice."
He threatened you.
"He threatened everything I hold dear." Elizabeth reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was cold, despite the warmth of her touch. "I understand," she said, her voice soft. "You did what you had to do.
You protected me.
You protected us." She pulled him close, her arms wrapping around him, holding him tight. They stood there for a long moment, locked in an embrace, their bodies trembling, their hearts aching. The night of revelations had changed everything, but it had also solidified their bond, their love, their unwavering commitment to each other. The wind still howled, but inside the shack, a fragile peace began to settle. Chapter 13. The Escape from Paris. The journey back to Paris was a blur of fear and uncertainty. They traveled by night, avoiding the main roads, relying on the kindness of strangers and the cover of darkness. Nathaniel's wound, though not life-threatening, slowed them down, the pain a constant reminder of their precarious situation. They were fugitives, hunted by the remnants of Du Bois's network, their faces likely plastered on wanted posters in every police station and military outpost across France. They couldn't return to Elizabeth's apartment, or any of their known haunts. Du Bois's reach was long, his influence pervasive. They were like mice in a maze, desperately searching for an exit, while the cat watched, waited, and prepared to pounce. They decided their only hope was to reach someone outside of Du Bois's network, someone with enough power and influence to expose the truth and protect them. someone they had initially dismissed, given Nathaniel's focus on General Du Bois. Madeline Moreau, Elizabeth said, as they huddled in a deserted barn, sharing a meager meal of stale bread and cheese. She might be our only chance. Madeline Moreau was a prominent journalist, known for her investigative reporting and her fearless pursuit of truth. She had a reputation for being incorruptible, a rare quality in the murky world of post-war politics. Elizabeth had met her briefly during her work as a translator and had been impressed by her intelligence and her unwavering commitment to justice. "It's a long shot," Nathaniel said, his voice weary. "She doesn't know us. Why would she risk her career, her reputation, her life, to help us?" "She believes in justice," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "She believes in exposing corruption. And she has the power to do it. She has the ear of the public, the respect of the press, the connections to bring this whole conspiracy crashing down." They knew reaching Madeline Moreau would be dangerous. They would have to return to Paris, to the heart of the enemy's territory, to the very place they had been desperately trying to escape. But they had no other choice. They arrived in Paris under the cover of darkness, slipping into the city like ghosts, avoiding the main streets, sticking to the shadows. They found a temporary refuge in a small, abandoned cellar beneath a bombed-out building, a place that reeked of damp earth and decay, a place that was a stark reminder of the destruction and devastation of the war. Elizabeth used a network of contacts she had developed during her time as a nurse, sympathetic doctors, grateful patients, fellow volunteers to arrange a meeting with Madeline Moreau. It was a risky endeavor, each contact a potential leak, each message a potential betrayal. But they had no other choice. The meeting was set for the following evening, in a secluded corner of the Jardin du Luxembourg, a place where they could blend in with the crowds, disappear into the anonymity of the city. The day dragged by, agonizingly slow. They spent the hours huddled in the cellar, their bodies aching, their minds racing, their nerves frayed. They were like two prisoners, awaiting their execution, their fate hanging in the balance. As evening approached, they prepared for the meeting, their movements cautious and deliberate. They knew that this was their last chance, their final opportunity to expose the truth, to clear their names, to survive. They arrived at the Jardin du Luxembourg separately, Elizabeth going first, Nathaniel following a few minutes later. They scanned the crowds, their eyes searching for any sign of surveillance, any indication that they were being watched. They found Madeline Moreau waiting for them near the Medici fountain, a grand, Baroque structure that depicted the mythical story of Polyphemus and Galatea. She was a striking woman, with sharp features, piercing eyes, and an air of quiet authority. Elizabeth approached her first, her heart pounding in her chest. "Madame Moreau?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. Madeline Moreau turned, her eyes assessing Elizabeth with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Yes," she said, her voice cool and professional. "My name is Elizabeth Garrison," Elizabeth said. "We met briefly, a few months ago. I work as a translator. I have information, important information, about a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government." Madeline Moreau listened intently, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question. She simply listened. Elizabeth told her everything, her voice low and urgent, her words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and desperation. She told her about Nathaniel, about Finch, about Du Bois, about the coded messages, about the betrayal, about the murder. She told her about the unsent letter and gave a copy to the journalist. She gave her a copy of the coded book and the translated list of names. When Elizabeth finished her story, Madeline Moreau remained silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth's face. Then she spoke, her voice low and measured. "This is a very serious accusation, Mademoiselle Garrison," she said. "If what you say is true, it could shake the foundations of our government. It could destroy careers, ruin lives, shatter the public's trust." "It's true," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "I swear it's true. And we have proof. We have evidence." Madeline Moreau nodded slowly. I believe you, she said. But I need to see the evidence myself. I need to verify your claims. I need to be absolutely certain before I publish anything. She looked around the crowded garden, her eyes scanning the faces, searching for any sign of danger.
We can't talk here, she said.
It's too risky. Meet me tomorrow morning. At my office. On the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Be careful. And don't trust anyone. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Elizabeth and Nathaniel standing alone, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They had taken the first step, they had reached out to someone who could help them, but the journey was far from over. The escape from Paris was just the beginning. The real battle was about to begin. Chapter 14. Across the Trenches. The Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré was a world away from the damp cellar where Elizabeth and Nathaniel had spent the night. The street, known for its luxury boutiques and elegant residences, was a symbol of Parisian wealth and power, a stark contrast to the hidden corners of the city where they had been forced to seek refuge. The air here was cleaner, the sounds more refined, the people more polished. But beneath the veneer of sophistication, danger still lurked. They arrived at Madeleine Moreau's office separately, as they had done the previous evening, taking different routes, avoiding any appearance of being together. The office was located in a discreet, unassuming building, sandwiched between a high-end fashion house and an antique shop. The only indication of its purpose was a small, brass plaque beside the door, engraved with the words, La Vérité, the truth. Elizabeth went first, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She entered the building, climbing the narrow, winding staircase to the second floor. She found the office door, took a deep breath and knocked. Madeleine Moreau opened the door, her face a mask of professional calm. She ushered Elizabeth inside, closing the door behind her and locking it. The office was surprisingly small, cluttered with books, papers, and photographs. The walls were covered with framed newspaper articles, awards, and mementos of a long and distinguished career. The air was thick with the smell of ink, paper, and stale coffee. You made it, Madeleine Moreau said, her voice devoid of any emotion. Good.
Sit down.
Elizabeth sat in a worn leather chair opposite Madeleine Moreau's desk. She felt a knot of tension in her stomach, a mixture of fear and anticipation. Did you bring the evidence? Madeleine Moreau asked, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth's face. Elizabeth nodded, her hand reaching into her bag, pulling out the leather-bound book and the unsent letter. She placed them on the desk, her fingers trembling slightly. Madeleine Moreau picked up the book, her eyes scanning the coded messages, her brow furrowing in concentration. She then read the letter, with the same focus. She spent several minutes examining the documents, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting Elizabeth's. This is explosive, she said, her voice low and measured. If this is true, it could bring down the entire government. It is true, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. I swear it's true. And we can prove it. Nathaniel Major Blackwood, he has more information. He has first-hand knowledge of the conspiracy. Madeleine Moreau nodded. Bring him in, she said. I need to hear his story. I need to see if your accounts corroborate. Elizabeth hesitated, her mind racing. Bringing Nathaniel into the open was risky. It exposed him to danger, to the possibility of capture, or worse. But they had no other choice. They needed Madeleine Moreau's help, and they needed to convince her that their story was true. She left the office, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Nathaniel waiting in a small cafe across the street, his face hidden behind a newspaper, his body tense, his eyes scanning the crowds. She approached him cautiously, her voice low and urgent.
She wants to see you, she said.
She wants to hear your story. Nathaniel nodded, his expression grim. He folded the newspaper, his hand reaching inside his coat, checking the pistol he had concealed there. They crossed the street together, their movements synchronized, their senses on high alert. They entered the building, climbed the stairs, and approached the office door. Elizabeth knocked, her hand trembling slightly. Madeleine Moreau opened the door, her eyes flicking between Elizabeth and Nathaniel. Come in, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. They entered the office, closing the door behind them. The room felt smaller now, more claustrophobic, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Nathaniel stood before Madeline Moreau's desk, his body straight, his gaze unwavering. He told his story, his voice clear and concise, his words painting a vivid picture of the conspiracy, the betrayal, the murder. He spoke of his early suspicions, his investigation, his discovery of Finch's involvement, his confrontation with Du Bois. He spoke of the coded messages, the list of names, the evidence that proved the existence of a vast network of corruption and deceit. Madeline Moreau listened intently, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question. She simply listened. She was like a judge, weighing the evidence, assessing the credibility of the witnesses, searching for the truth. When Nathaniel finished his story, Madeline Moreau remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on his face. Then, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "I believe you," she said. "I believe your story. And I believe you have the evidence to prove it." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room, settling on the framed newspaper articles, the awards, the mementos of her career. "This is a dangerous game, Major Blackwood, Mademoiselle Garrison," she said. "You are up against powerful enemies, enemies who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Are you prepared for the consequences? Are you prepared to fight?" Nathaniel and Elizabeth exchanged a look, their eyes meeting, their hands clasping together. They had crossed the trenches, from the battlefield to the newsroom, from the front lines of war to the front lines of truth. And they were ready. "We are," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. "We're ready to fight." Chapter 15. The Field Hospital's Secret. Madeline Moreau's decision to help them was a turning point, but it also marked the beginning of a new, even more dangerous phase of their struggle. They were no longer alone, hunted fugitives. They had a powerful ally, a weapon that could potentially expose the conspiracy and bring the guilty to justice. But they also had a target on their backs, a target that would attract the attention of Du Bois's network, the remnants of his power structure, the people who had everything to lose. Madeline Moreau arranged for them to stay in a safe house, a secluded apartment above a printing press in the Marais district. It was a noisy, bustling place, filled with the constant rumble of machinery, the smell of ink and paper, the chatter of workers. But it was also a place where they could blend in, disappear into the anonymity of the city, a place where they could work with Madeline Moreau to prepare their case, to gather more evidence, to build a narrative that would withstand the scrutiny of the public and the courts. "We need to find more than just circumstantial evidence," Madeline Moreau said, as they huddled around a small table in the safe house, poring over the documents they had salvaged from Finch's flat and the information Nathaniel had gathered during his investigation. "We need something concrete, something irrefutable, something that will link General Du Bois and his co-conspirators directly to the conspiracy." "There might be something," Elizabeth said, her voice hesitant. "Something I remember from my time as a nurse. A conversation I overheard. A secret hidden in a field hospital near the front lines." During the war, Elizabeth had volunteered at a field hospital near Amiens, a place of chaos and suffering, of mangled bodies and shattered minds. She had seen things there, heard things, that had haunted her dreams for years. One memory in particular had always stuck with her, a fragment of a conversation she had overheard between two wounded officers, a conversation that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now, in light of everything that had happened, took on a new, sinister meaning. "I was tending to a wounded officer," Elizabeth explained, her voice trembling slightly as she recalled the scene. "He was delirious, rambling, muttering about a meeting, a secret meeting, in the hospital chapel. He mentioned General Du Bois's name and the name of another officer, a Colonel Moreau, no relation, I'm sure," she said, glancing at the journalist. "They were discussing payments, shipments, a betrayal." "The hospital chapel," Nathaniel said, his eyes narrowing. "It's possible. It would have been a secure location, a place where they could meet without arousing suspicion." "We need to go there," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "We need to see if there's anything left, any evidence, any clue that can link Du Bois and his co-conspirators to the conspiracy." Madeline Moreau agreed.
It's a long shot, she said.
But it's worth a try. We need to exhaust every possibility. We need to leave no stone unturned. They knew that returning to the field hospital would be dangerous. It was close to the front lines, even now, a year after the armistice. The area was still heavily militarized, patrolled by soldiers, riddled with unexploded ordnance, a place of lingering tensions and unresolved conflicts. But they had no other choice. They traveled under the cover of darkness, using back roads and hidden paths, avoiding the main thoroughfares. Madeline Moreau, using her press credentials and her network of contacts, managed to secure them passage on a military supply truck, a risky endeavor, but the fastest and most discreet way to reach their destination. The field hospital was a desolate, haunting place. The once bustling tents and makeshift buildings were now empty, abandoned, their canvas walls ripped and tattered, their wooden frames rotting and collapsing. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of disinfectant, of lingering death. They found the hospital chapel, a small, wooden structure that had once served as a place of solace and prayer for the wounded and dying. The windows were shattered, the altar was overturned, the pews were broken and scattered. But the structure itself was still intact, a silent witness to the horrors of war and the secrets it concealed. They began their search, their footsteps echoing in the empty chapel, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They examined the walls, the floor, the remaining furniture, searching for any hidden compartments, any loose floorboards, any sign of anything that might have been left behind. Elizabeth, guided by her memory of the wounded officer's ramblings, focused on the area near the altar. She remembered him mentioning something about a loose stone, a hidden cavity, a place where documents could be concealed. She ran her hands along the cold, stone floor, her fingers probing the cracks and crevices, searching for any sign of a disturbance. She felt something, a slight indentation, a subtle shift in the stone. She called out to Nathaniel, her voice trembling with excitement. "I think I've found something." Nathaniel rushed to her side, his eyes scanning the floor. He knelt down, his fingers tracing the outline of the loose stone. He pried it loose, revealing a small, dark cavity beneath. Inside the cavity, they found a small, metal box. It was locked, but Nathaniel, using his skills as a soldier, managed to force it open. Inside the box, they found a collection of documents, letters, and photographs. It was a treasure trove of evidence, a damning indictment of General Du Bois and his co-conspirators. There were letters detailing the sale of military secrets to the enemy, lists of payments made to corrupt officials, photographs of clandestine meetings, and a detailed plan for a coordinated attack on Allied positions, an attack that had resulted in the deaths of thousands of soldiers. It was the concrete, irrefutable evidence they had been searching for. The secret of the field hospital had been revealed, and it was more damning than they could have ever imagined. They had what they needed. Chapter 16. A Promise Under Fire. The discovery of the metal box in the field hospital chapel was a pivotal moment, a turning of the tide in their desperate struggle against the conspiracy. They had the evidence, the irrefutable proof that would expose General Du Bois and his network of collaborators, the proof that would clear their names and bring the guilty to justice. But they still had to get that evidence to the right people, to someone who could act on it, to someone who could withstand the pressure, the threats, the inevitable backlash from those who had everything to lose. Madeline Moreau, with her journalistic integrity and her network of contacts, was their best hope. But even she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, powerful allies, within the government, within the military, within the press, who would support her, protect her, and ensure that the truth was revealed, no matter the cost. "We need to go public," Madeline Moreau said, as they huddled in the safe house above the printing press, the rumble of the machinery a constant reminder of the power of the press, the power of information, the power of truth. "We need to publish the evidence, expose the conspiracy, and force the government to act." "But it's too dangerous," Nathaniel argued, his voice filled with concern. "Du Bois's people are still out there. They'll be looking for us. They'll stop at nothing to silence us." "We have no other choice," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "We can't keep running, hiding, living in fear.
We need to fight back.
We need to expose the truth, for ourselves, for the soldiers who died because of this conspiracy, for the future of our country. Madeline Moreau agreed. We'll take precautions, she said. We'll publish the evidence anonymously, at first, to protect ourselves. We'll leak it to multiple sources, to ensure that it can't be suppressed. We'll build a firewall of support, a network of allies who will stand with us, who will defend us, who will ensure that the truth prevails. They spent the next few days working tirelessly, preparing the evidence for publication, crafting a narrative that would capture the public's attention, exposing the conspiracy in all its sordid detail. They worked in shifts, sleeping in snatches, fueled by adrenaline and a shared sense of purpose. Madeline Moreau used her contacts within the press to plant the story, leaking snippets of information, hinting at a major scandal, building anticipation and excitement. She reached out to trusted colleagues, fellow journalists, editors, and publishers, who were known for their integrity and their commitment to truth. She also contacted key figures within the government and the military, individuals who were known for their honesty and their patriotism, individuals who would be willing to stand up against corruption and deceit. The response was slow at first, hesitant, cautious. Many were skeptical, unwilling to believe that such a vast conspiracy could exist, unwilling to risk their careers, their reputations, their lives, on the word of a disgraced officer and a former nurse. But as more evidence emerged, as more details were revealed, as the story gained momentum, the tide began to turn. People started to listen, to question, to demand answers. The whispers of conspiracy grew louder, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. The day of the publication arrived, a day of reckoning, a day of truth. The story broke like a thunderclap, echoing across the nation, shaking the foundations of the government, shattering the illusion of peace and stability that had settled over post-war France. La Vérité, Madeline Moreau's newspaper, published the first installment of Expose, a detailed account of the conspiracy, supported by the evidence they had gathered. The headline screamed, "Treason at the top." The reaction was immediate and explosive. The public was outraged, demanding answers, demanding justice. The government was thrown into chaos, ministers scrambling to deny the accusations, to distance themselves from the scandal, to save their own skins. The military launched an investigation, arresting several high-ranking officers who were implicated in the conspiracy. The press went into a frenzy, publishing follow-up stories, digging deeper, uncovering more evidence, exposing more corruption. Nathaniel and Elizabeth, watching the events unfold from the safety of their hidden refuge, felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Their struggle, their sacrifice, their unwavering commitment to truth had finally paid off. The conspiracy was exposed, the guilty were being brought to justice, and their names were being cleared. But the danger was not over. Du Bois's network, though weakened, was still active, still desperate to silence them, to prevent the full truth from emerging. They knew they were still targets, still hunted, still vulnerable. One evening, as they sat huddled together in the safe house, listening to the radio reports of the unfolding scandal, they heard a sudden noise outside, a scuffling sound, followed by a muffled cry. Nathaniel grabbed his pistol, his body tensing, his senses on high alert. He moved to the door, cautiously peering through the peephole. He saw a group of men, dressed in plain clothes, their faces obscured by shadows, forcing their way into the printing press below. They were armed, dangerous, and clearly looking for something or someone. "They're here," Nathaniel said, his voice low and urgent. "They've found us." He turned to Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to get out of here," he said.
Now.
They grabbed their few belongings, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew this was it, their final stand, their last chance to escape. As they crept out of the safe house, heading for a back exit that led to a maze of narrow alleyways, they heard shouts and gunfire from below. The men were getting closer. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was one of Du Bois's men, a ruthless killer who had been hunting them for weeks. He raised his pistol, aiming it at Nathaniel. "It's over, Blackwood," he sneered. You're finished." Before the man could fire, a shot rang out from behind them. The man staggered, his eyes widening in surprise, then collapsed to the ground, dead. Standing behind them, her own pistol still smoking, was Madeline Moreau.
"Go,"
she shouted. "Get out of here. I'll hold them off." Nathaniel and Elizabeth didn't hesitate. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the narrow alleyways, the sounds of gunfire and shouts fading behind them. They ran until they could run no more, until they were far away from the printing press, far away from the danger, far away from the city that had become their prison. They found refuge in a small, rural village, far from Paris, far from the reach of Du Bois's network. They were safe for now. But the fight was not over. Under the vast, starlit sky of the countryside, Nathaniel turned to Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a profound love and a renewed sense of purpose. "We'll finish this, Elizabeth," he said, his voice firm. "We'll see this through to the end. I promise you." He took her hand and made his promise under fire, under the stars. Chapter 17. The Betrayal Revealed. The quietude of the rural village was a balm to their frayed nerves, a stark contrast to the relentless tension of Paris. They found temporary sanctuary in a farmhouse, its owners, an elderly couple, sympathetic to their plight and willing to offer them shelter without asking too many questions. The days were slow, filled with the simple rhythms of rural life, the crowing of roosters, the bleating of sheep, the smell of freshly baked bread. But the nights were long, haunted by the memories of their ordeal, by the fear of discovery, by the uncertainty of their future. Despite their relative safety, they knew they couldn't remain hidden forever. The conspiracy was still unfolding, the wheels of justice turning slowly, grindingly. Madeline Moreau, their courageous ally, was working tirelessly in Paris, publishing more evidence, rallying support, fighting the forces of corruption and deceit that still clung to power. But she needed their help. She needed their testimony, their first-hand account of the events, to bring the full truth to light. "We need to return to Paris," Elizabeth said one evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls of the farmhouse. "We can't hide here forever. We need to testify, to tell our story, to ensure that justice is served." Nathaniel nodded, his expression grim. He knew she was right. They had come this far, they had sacrificed so much, they couldn't back down now. But the thought of returning to Paris, to the heart of the enemy's territory, filled him with dread. "It's too dangerous," he said, his voice low. "They'll be waiting for us. They'll be watching every move we make." "We'll be careful," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "We'll have Madeline's protection. We'll have the support of the people who believe in us. We won't be alone." They decided to make their move, to return to Paris, to face their enemies, to finish what they had started. They contacted Madeline Moreau, using a coded message sent through a trusted intermediary, arranging a clandestine meeting in a safe location. The journey back to Paris was fraught with tension, each mile a potential trap, each encounter a potential betrayal. They traveled by night, avoiding the main roads, relying on the kindness of strangers and the cover of darkness. They arrived in Paris under the cloak of a foggy dawn, slipping into the city like ghosts, their hearts pounding in their chests. They met Madeline Moreau in a small, hidden courtyard behind a church, a place of quiet contemplation, a place where they hoped to find sanctuary and guidance. Madeline Moreau greeted them with a mixture of relief and concern. "You made it," she said, her voice low. "I'm glad you're safe. But things are complicated." She explained that the situation in Paris had become even more volatile. The publication of the evidence had triggered a political earthquake, shaking the foundations of the government, exposing the deep-seated corruption that had festered for years. The forces of opposition, the remnants of Du Bois's network, were fighting back, using their influence, their connections, their wealth, to suppress the truth, to discredit the evidence, to silence their accusers. "They're trying to paint you as traitors," Madeline Moreau said, her voice grim. "As disgruntled officers, seeking revenge, spreading lies, destabilizing the country." "We need to testify," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. "We need to tell our story, to present the evidence, to clear our names. It's not that simple, Madeline Moreau said. The courts are controlled by their allies. The judges are biased. The witnesses are intimidated. It's a rigged game. She paused, her eyes searching theirs. There's only one way to win this, she said. We need to go directly to the people. We need to appeal to their sense of justice, their sense of patriotism, their sense of outrage. We need to bypass the corrupt courts, the biased judges, the intimidated witnesses. We need a public trial, a trial by the people. Madeline Moreau proposed a daring plan, a risky gambit that could either expose the conspiracy once and for all or destroy them completely. She proposed holding a public meeting, a rally, in a large, open space, where Nathaniel and Elizabeth could tell their story, present the evidence, and appeal directly to the people of Paris. It was a dangerous proposition, a potential trap, a stage set for violence and chaos. But it was also their only hope. They agreed to the plan, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They knew they were walking into the lion's den, facing their enemies head-on, risking everything for the sake of truth and justice. The meeting was set for the following evening, in the Place de la Bastille, a symbolic location, a place of revolution, a place of defiance, a place where the people of Paris had risen up against tyranny and oppression in the past. The day dragged by, agonizingly slow. They spent the hours preparing their testimony, rehearsing their speeches, steeling their nerves. They were like actors preparing for a performance that would determine their fate, a performance that would either vindicate them or condemn them. As evening approached, they made their way to the Place de la Bastille, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses on high alert. The square was already filling with people, a vast crowd of Parisians from all walks of life, workers, students, soldiers, veterans, ordinary citizens who had come to hear their story, to witness their testimony, to demand justice. They mounted a makeshift stage, a platform erected in the center of the square, facing the crowd. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation, with tension, with a sense of impending confrontation. Nathaniel spoke first, his voice clear and strong, echoing across the square. He told his story, his voice filled with passion and conviction, his words painting a vivid picture of the conspiracy, the betrayal, the murder. He presented the evidence, the coded messages, the list of names, the photographs, the letters, the documents that proved the existence of a vast network of corruption and deceit. The crowd listened intently, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. They gasped, they murmured, they shouted their outrage. Then, it was Elizabeth's turn. She spoke of her experiences as a nurse, of the horrors she had witnessed, of the wounded soldiers who had died because of the conspiracy, of the secret she had uncovered in the field hospital chapel. Her voice trembled with emotion, but her words were clear and powerful, her testimony a damning indictment of the guilty. As Elizabeth finished her speech, a sudden commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. A group of men, dressed in plain clothes, their faces contorted with anger, began pushing their way towards the stage, shouting threats, brandishing weapons. They were Du Bois's men, the remnants of his network, determined to silence Nathaniel and Elizabeth, to prevent the truth from emerging. The crowd surged forward, a wave of humanity, determined to protect Nathaniel and Elizabeth, to defend the truth, to fight for justice. A battle erupted in the Place de la Bastille, a clash between the forces of good and evil, a struggle for the soul of France. In that very instant, a shot was fired. But this shot was not aimed at Nathaniel or Elizabeth. The bullet hit the leader of the thugs trying to attack them. The shooter was no other than General Armand Du Bois's former aide, Colonel Moreau, the man who had been mentioned alongside the general in the delirious ramblings of the dying soldier. He shouted, so that everyone could hear, "General Du Bois was my mentor, and I could not believe he was a traitor. I had to make sure. I owed that much to my conscience. I followed you. I saw. I heard. I know the truth. And I will testify." The betrayal, it turned out, had a final, unexpected twist. Chapter 18. The Reckoning at Dawn. Colonel Moreau's unexpected intervention turned the tide of the battle in the Place de la Bastille. His confession, his willingness to testify, his dramatic act of defiance against Dubois's men galvanized the crowd, turning their outrage into a unified force for justice. The thugs, outnumbered and outmatched, were quickly subdued, disarmed, and arrested by the police, who had finally arrived on the scene, spurred to action by the sheer force of public opinion. The aftermath of the confrontation was chaotic, but ultimately triumphant. Nathaniel and Elizabeth, shaken but unharmed, were hailed as heroes, their courage and their unwavering commitment to truth celebrated by the crowd. Madeleine Moreau, her journalistic instincts vindicated, her reputation enhanced, stood beside them, a symbol of the power of the press, the power of information, the power of truth. Colonel Moreau, his face a mask of remorse and determination, was taken into custody, promising to cooperate fully with the authorities, to reveal everything he knew about the conspiracy, to name names, to provide evidence, to ensure that justice was served. The events in the Place de la Bastille marked a turning point, a decisive victory in the struggle against the conspiracy. The truth was out, the public was informed, the forces of opposition were in disarray. But the fight was not over. The legal battles, the political maneuvering, the inevitable attempts to suppress the evidence and discredit the witnesses still lay ahead. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Nathaniel and Elizabeth, under the protection of Madeleine Moreau and a growing number of allies within the government and the military, were summoned to testify before a special commission of inquiry, a panel of judges and investigators tasked with uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy and bringing the guilty to justice. They told their story, again and again, presenting the evidence, answering questions, enduring cross-examination, facing down their accusers. They were subjected to intense scrutiny, their motives questioned, their credibility challenged, their lives dissected and analyzed. But they stood firm, their resolve unwavering, their commitment to truth unshaken. They had the support of the public, the backing of the press, and the growing confidence of the authorities. Colonel Moreau's testimony was crucial. He provided a detailed account of Dubois's activities, his connections, his methods, his motivations. He named names, provided dates, locations, and details of clandestine meetings, secret transactions, and covert operations. He painted a picture of a vast network of corruption and deceit, a network that had infiltrated the highest levels of government and the military. The Commission of Inquiry, armed with the evidence presented by Nathaniel, Elizabeth, Colonel Moreau, and a growing number of other witnesses, issued its report, a damning indictment of General Dubois and his co-conspirators. The report detailed the full extent of the conspiracy, the crimes that had been committed, the lives that had been lost, the damage that had been done. The report called for the arrest and prosecution of dozens of high-ranking officials, military officers, industrialists, and politicians. It called for a sweeping reform of the government and the military, a cleansing of the corruption that had festered for years. The government, under intense public pressure, was forced to act. Arrests were made, trials were scheduled, investigations were launched. The wheels of justice, though slow and often cumbersome, began to turn. The trials were a public spectacle, a dramatic confrontation between the forces of good and evil, a reckoning for the crimes that had been committed. Nathaniel and Elizabeth, along with Colonel Moreau and Madeleine Moreau, were key witnesses, their testimony crucial to securing convictions. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere electric, the tension palpable. The defendants, the former pillars of society, the men who had once wielded immense power and influence, sat in the dock, their faces pale, their eyes filled with fear and apprehension. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning, the outcome inevitable. One by one, the defendants were found guilty, convicted of treason, conspiracy, corruption, and murder. They were sentenced to long prison terms, their careers ruined, their reputations shattered, their lives forever tainted by their crimes. The reckoning had come, at dawn, after a long and arduous night. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. As the trials concluded, as the dust settled, as the city of Paris began to heal from the wounds of the conspiracy, Nathaniel and Elizabeth found themselves standing on the banks of the Seine, watching the sun rise over the city. They had been through so much, faced so many dangers, endured so much pain and suffering. But they had survived. They had triumphed. They had exposed the truth, cleared their names, and brought the guilty to justice. They had also found something precious, something enduring, something that had sustained them through the darkest of times, their love for each other. Nathaniel turned to Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a profound love and a deep sense of gratitude. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "We did it," he said, his voice soft. "We won." Elizabeth smiled, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy and relief. "We did it together," she said. "We always do." They stood there for a long moment, locked in an embrace, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the city in a golden light, a symbol of hope, of renewal, of a new beginning. The reckoning was over. A new day had dawned. Chapter 19. The Long Road Home. With the trials concluded and justice served, a sense of closure, albeit tinged with the lingering shadows of their ordeal, settled over Nathaniel and Elizabeth. The city of Paris, once a battleground of secrets and betrayals, began to feel like a place of healing, a place where they could finally exhale and contemplate their future. The weight of the conspiracy, the constant threat of danger, had lifted, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. However, the road ahead was not without its challenges. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, remained. Nathaniel still bore the marks of his injuries, and both he and Elizabeth carried the invisible wounds of trauma, the memories of loss, the anxieties of their near-constant peril. They needed time to heal, to rebuild, to find their way back to a semblance of normalcy. Madeleine Moreau, their steadfast ally, remained a close friend and confidant. She had offered Nathaniel a position at La Verite, an opportunity to use his skills and experience in a new and meaningful way. He had accepted, eager to contribute to the cause of truth and justice in a different capacity, to move beyond the violence and deception of his past. Elizabeth, too, was contemplating her future. She had returned to her work as a translator, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of language, in the quiet focus of her craft. But she also felt a growing desire to do more, to use her experiences to help others, to make a difference in the world. She began volunteering at a local hospital, offering comfort and support to wounded veterans, helping them navigate the long and arduous road to recovery. They decided to remain in Paris, at least for the time being. The city, despite its association with their recent struggles, held a special significance for them. It was where they had reunited, where they had fought for justice, where they had found strength in each other's love. It was also a place where they could build a new life, a life free from the shadows of the war, a life filled with hope and possibility. They found a small apartment in the Latin Quarter, a vibrant, bohemian neighborhood filled with students, artists, and intellectuals. It was a place of lively cafes, bustling bookstores, and hidden courtyards, a place where they could feel a sense of community, a sense of belonging. Their days were filled with simple pleasures, walks along the Seine, picnics in the Jardin du Luxembourg, visits to museums and art galleries, quiet evenings at home, reading, talking, simply being together. They were slowly, gradually, rebuilding their lives, piecing together the fragments of their shattered past, creating a new, stronger foundation for their future. One evening, as they sat on their small balcony, overlooking the rooftops of Paris, Nathaniel turned to Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and longing. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said, his voice soft. "I never thought we'd make it through. I thought I'd lost you forever." Elizabeth reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We made it," she said. "We survived. And we're stronger for it." "I love you, Elizabeth," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than words can say. You're my life, my love, my everything." "And I love you, Nathaniel," Elizabeth said, her eyes sparkling with tears. "You're my anchor, my strength, my home." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. They kissed, a slow, tender kiss that spoke volumes of their love, their commitment, their shared journey. The long road home had been arduous, filled with obstacles and challenges, with pain and suffering. But they had traveled it together, hand in hand, their love a guiding light, a source of strength, a beacon of hope. They had reached their destination, a place of peace, of healing, of new beginnings. As the sun set over the city of Paris, casting a warm, golden glow over the rooftops, Nathaniel and Elizabeth knew that their journey was far from over. Life would continue to present challenges, obstacles, uncertainties. But they were ready. They were together. And that, they knew, was all that mattered. They were ready to begin building a life that honored the sacrifices of the past, while holding on to the promise of their shared future. Chapter 20. A New Beginning. The years that followed were a testament to their resilience, their love, and their unwavering commitment to each other. Nathaniel thrived at La Verite, his investigative skills honed by his wartime experiences proving invaluable in his new role as a journalist. He became a champion of truth and justice, exposing corruption, fighting for the underdog, giving voice to the voiceless. He found a sense of purpose and fulfillment in his work, a way to channel his past traumas into a positive force for change. Elizabeth continued her work as a translator, while also dedicating more and more of her time to helping wounded veterans. She became a passionate advocate for their needs, working tirelessly to improve their access to healthcare, rehabilitation, and social support. She found solace and meaning in her work, her own experiences giving her a deep empathy and understanding for the struggles of those who had been scarred by war. They built a life together in Paris, a life filled with love, laughter, and a shared sense of purpose. Their apartment in the Latin Quarter became a haven, a place of warmth and welcome, a gathering place for friends, colleagues, and fellow veterans. They hosted lively dinners, engaged in passionate debates, and shared stories of their past, their present, and their hopes for the future. They never forgot the horrors they had witnessed, the sacrifices they had made, the dangers they had faced.
But they refused to be defined by their past.
They chose to focus on the future, on building a life that honored the memory of those who had been lost, a life that was a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. One sunny afternoon, as they strolled hand in hand through the Jardin du Luxembourg, a place that held so many memories for them, both joyful and painful, Nathaniel stopped and turned to Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice soft, "about the future."
About us.
Elizabeth smiled, her heart filled with a warmth that spread through her entire being. "What about the future?" she asked. Nathaniel took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "I want to build a family with you, Elizabeth," he said. "I want to have children, to create a home filled with love and laughter, to build a legacy that will extend beyond our own lives." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, tears of gratitude, tears of a love that had endured the trials of war and the challenges of peace. "I want that too, Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembling slightly.
"More than anything."
They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The sun shone down on them, casting a warm, golden glow, a symbol of hope, of renewal, of a new beginning. They knew that the path ahead would not always be easy. Life would continue to present challenges, obstacles, uncertainties. But they were ready. They were together. And they had a love that could conquer anything. They walked on, hand in hand, their steps filled with a newfound sense of purpose, a renewed sense of hope. They were embarking on a new chapter in their lives, a chapter filled with the promise of family, of children, of a future built on the foundations of love, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to each other. As they reached the Medici fountain, the place where they had met Madeleine Moreau, the place where their journey towards justice had truly begun, they paused and looked at each other, their eyes reflecting the deep love and gratitude they felt for each other, for the life they had built, for the future that awaited them. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, a chance to create a life that was a testament to the power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring hope for a better tomorrow. The war was over, the conspiracy was exposed, justice had been served. Now it was time to live, to love, to build a future worthy of the sacrifices they had made. Their new beginning was here. Epilogue. The years spun a tapestry of joys and sorrows, of triumphs and setbacks, weaving a rich and complex pattern into the lives of Nathaniel and Elizabeth Blackwood. Their home in the Latin Quarter became a sanctuary, not just for them, but for a growing circle of friends, family, and fellow veterans who found solace and support in their unwavering love and their commitment to a better world. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, arrived 2 years after their return to Paris, a symbol of their resilience, their enduring optimism, and their faith in the future. 2 more children followed, a son named Thomas, after Elizabeth's father, and another daughter, named Madeline, after their courageous friend and ally. Nathaniel continued his work at La Vérité, becoming a respected and influential voice in French journalism, a champion of truth and justice, a relentless advocate for the voiceless. He never forgot the lessons he had learned during the war, the horrors he had witnessed, the sacrifices he had made. He used his platform to expose corruption, to fight for social reform, to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. Elizabeth divided her time between raising their children and her work with wounded veterans. She became a tireless advocate for their needs, establishing a foundation that provided support, rehabilitation, and opportunities for those who had been scarred by war. She found a deep sense of purpose and fulfillment in her work, her own experiences giving her a unique empathy and understanding for the struggles of those she served. Their children grew up in a home filled with love, laughter, and a strong sense of social responsibility. They learned about their parents' past, about the war, about the conspiracy, about the importance of fighting for what is right, even in the face of adversity. They inherited their parents' courage, their compassion, and their unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. As the years passed, the memories of the war, of the conspiracy, of their desperate struggle for survival, began to fade, replaced by the joys and challenges of everyday life. But the lessons they had learned, the values they had embraced, the love they had shared, remained, etched into their hearts, woven into the fabric of their being. One autumn evening, many years after their return to Paris, Nathaniel and Elizabeth found themselves standing on their balcony, overlooking the city, the Eiffel Tower shimmering in the distance, the Seine flowing silently below. They were older now, their hair streaked with silver, their faces lined with the passage of time. But their love for each other was as strong as ever, a beacon of hope and resilience, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Nathaniel reached out and took Elizabeth's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, his voice soft, his gaze reflecting the countless memories they shared. Elizabeth smiled, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of joy and gratitude. "We have," she said. "And we did it together." They stood there for a long moment, silent, content, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The city below them hummed with life, a vibrant tapestry of sights and sounds, a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. They had lived through war, through betrayal, through loss, through hardship. But they had also found love, found purpose, found redemption. They had built a life together, a life filled with meaning, with joy, with a deep and abiding sense of gratitude. As the sun set over the city of Paris, casting a warm, golden glow over the rooftops, Nathaniel and Elizabeth Blackwood knew that their journey was far from over. Life would continue to present challenges, uncertainties, and new adventures. But they were ready. They were together. And their love, like the city itself, would endure. The photograph that had changed had brought them back to one another, and now they were building on that second chance, building a life that was a true testament to their love. The end.